You bought a soundbar or an AV receiver, you connected it to your TV with an HDMI cable, and it technically works, but something feels off. Maybe the sound is weaker than you expected. Maybe the Dolby Atmos logo shows up on screen, but the audio doesn't feel any different from regular stereo. Maybe there's a strange delay between the picture and the sound. Or the audio randomly cuts out for a second every so often. Your first instinct is to blame the soundbar. Maybe you got a bad unit. Maybe it's just not as good as the reviews said. But here's the truth. In the vast majority of cases, your soundbar isn't broken at all. The real problem is HDMI ARC, the connection responsible for getting audio from your TV to your sound system. And it's being set up wrong in one of three specific ways. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly what those three mistakes are and how to fix every one of them in just a few minutes. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a like so more people can fix this same problem. And tell me in the comments what soundbar or AV you're using right now and what specific issue you've been running into. Let's solve this. What HDMI ARC actually is? Before we dig into the mistakes, it helps to understand what ARC is actually doing. Because once you understand the mechanism, the mistakes become obvious. ARC stands for Audio Return Channel. The clever thing about ARC is that it lets audio travel backwards through the same HDMI cable that's already sending video forward from your receiver or streaming device to your TV. Before ARC existed, you needed a separate audio cable running from the TV back down to your sound system, which meant extra cables, extra clutter, and one more thing that could go wrong. ARC solved that by allowing a single HDMI cable to carry video one way and audio the other way at the same time. eARC is the newer, more capable version of this same idea. The E stands for enhanced, and the key difference is bandwidth. Standard ARC has a fairly limited amount of bandwidth to carry audio, which means it can handle compressed surround formats like standard Dolby Digital just fine. But it struggles with high bitrate formats like uncompressed multi-channel audio, Dolby True HD, and full Dolby Atmos. eARC has dramatically more bandwidth and can carry all of those advanced formats without compromise. Think of standard ARC as a single-lane road that handles regular traffic fine, but creates a bottleneck during rush hour, while eARC is a wide, multi-lane highway that can handle anything you throw at it without slowing down. Here's the simplest way to think about the difference for your own setup. ARC is mainly about convenience, letting you avoid extra cables. eARC is about both convenience and quality, because it actually has the bandwidth to deliver the full, true version of modern audio formats like Atmos. A lot of people assume that any HDMI connection is the same as any other, that HDMI is just HDMI and it either works or it doesn't. That assumption is exactly where these three mistakes come from. Because in reality, ARC only works correctly when the port, the settings, and the cable all line up correctly at the same time. Get one of those three wrong, and you end up with weak, flat, or missing audio even though everything looks properly connected. Mistake 1. Plugging into the wrong HDMI port. The first and most common mistake is plugging your soundbar or AV into the wrong HDMI port on the TV. This sounds like it should be obvious, but it trips up an enormous number of people because of how TVs are designed. Most modern televisions have somewhere between 2 and 4 HDMI inputs on the back or side panel. They all look identical. They're all standard HDMI ports that will accept any HDMI cable you plug into them. But here's the catch. Only one of those ports is actually wired to support ARC or ARC functionality. The others are regular HDMI inputs designed for sending video and audio into the TV from things like game consoles, streaming devices, or Blu-ray players. They have no ability to send audio back out to a connected sound system. If you plug your soundbar into one of those regular ports instead of the labeled ARC or eARC port, here's what happens. Your soundbar is sitting there, fully powered on, completely functional, waiting for an audio signal. But the TV has no path available to send that audio signal back to it, because the port you used was never designed to carry audio in that direction. The result is silence, or sometimes the soundbar defaults to its own internal speaker test tones, or simply shows no signal at all. People in this situation often spend hours troubleshooting, checking cables, restarting devices, even returning the soundbar entirely, when the actual fix is just moving one cable to a different port. What makes this mistake especially sneaky is that there's no consistent standard across brands, or even across different models from the same brand for which HDMI port number is the ARC port. On one TV, it might be HDMI 1, on another, it might be HDMI 3. Manufacturers place the ARC-capable port wherever it makes sense for their internal board design, not based on any universal rule. This means you genuinely cannot guess which port is correct just by looking at the numbers. The port has to be specifically labeled ARC or eARC, usually printed in small text right next to the HDMI input on the back panel. Sometimes the labeling is clear and easy to spot. Other times it's tiny, faded, or written at an awkward angle that makes it easy to miss entirely. Especially if your TV is mounted on a wall and you're trying to read labels by feel with your phone flashlight pointed behind the TV. The fix here is straightforward, but it requires being deliberate rather than just grabbing the nearest open port. Look specifically for the port labeled ARC or ARC on your TV, and connect that to the HDMI output on your soundbar or AVR, the one that's also labeled ARC or eARC. If you genuinely can't find the label or it's too worn to read, the TV's manual or a quick search of your exact TV model number online will tell you definitively which port number is the correct one. Don't assume that because a port is open and convenient, it's the right one to use. That single assumption is responsible for an enormous share of all the silent or broken audio setups people experience. Mistake 2, wrong TV audio output settings. Let's say you've got the port right. The soundbar is connected to the correct ARC or eARC port, and you're getting sound. But the sound feels thin, weak, or strangely flat, especially compared to what you expected from a system that supposedly supports Dolby Atmos. This is where the second mistake comes in. And it's one of the most misunderstood parts of the entire ARC chain, the TV's internal audio output setting. Here's what's happening behind the scenes that most people never think about. Your TV doesn't just pass audio straight through to your soundbar untouched. It processes that audio first. And the setting that controls how it processes it is buried in the audio settings menu, usually labeled something like digital audio output, audio format, or HDMI output. The two main options you'll typically see are PCM and Bitstream, sometimes labeled auto or pass-through instead of Bitstream depending on the brand. PCM stands for pulse code modulation. And when your TV is set to output PCM, it takes whatever audio format is coming in, whether that's Dolby Atmos or a standard stereo track, and converts it down into a simpler, more basic format before sending it out through ARC. Bitstream or pass-through mode does the opposite. It sends the original audio format through essentially untouched, preserving the full surround or Atmos information exactly as it was encoded. This is precisely why so many people report seeing the Dolby Atmos logo appear on their TV screen during a movie, but the audio they're actually hearing sounds nowhere near as immersive as it should. The Atmos logo on screen simply confirms that the source content, like a Netflix stream or a Blu-ray disc, contains Atmos audio. It does not confirm that your TV is actually passing that Atmos audio through to your soundbar correctly. If the TV's audio output is set to PCM, it's quietly collapsing all that rich, object-based, three-dimensional Atmos audio data down into basic stereo or simple surround before it ever reaches your sound system. You end up with a soundbar that's fully capable of Atmos, receiving audio that's already been stripped of everything that made Atmos special, and you have no on-screen indicator telling you this conversion happened. The fix requires going into your TV's audio settings menu and finding that digital audio output option. Switch it from PCM to Bitstream, auto, or pass-through, whichever terminology your specific TV brand uses. This tells the TV to stop converting the audio and instead pass the original format straight through to your soundbar. where the soundbar's own processor can decode it properly and deliver the full experience it's actually capable of. While you're in those settings, it's also worth enabling HDMI SEX if it isn't already on. CC stands for Consumer Electronics Control, and it's what allows your TV and soundbar to communicate with each other automatically. Things like your TV remote controlling the soundbar's volume, or the soundbar automatically switching to the correct input when the TV turns on. Different brands use different marketing names for this same feature. Samsung calls it AnyNet Plus. LG calls it SimpLink. Sony calls it Bravia Sync. They all do fundamentally the same job, so look for your brand's specific name for it in the settings menu and make sure it's switched on. Finally, double-check that your soundbar itself is set to receive input from TV ARC or eARC rather than sitting on a different input like Bluetooth or optical, because even with the TV side configured perfectly, the soundbar needs to be listening on the right input to actually receive that signal. Mistake 3. Using the wrong cable or expecting the wrong format. The third mistake is the one people are least likely to suspect, because it doesn't involve any settings menu at all. It's the physical HDMI cable itself. A lot of people assume that once you've got an HDMI cable working for picture, it must also be perfectly capable of handling any audio format you throw at it. That assumption is wrong. And it's wrong in a way that's particularly frustrating because two HDMI cables can look completely identical on the outside while having very different capabilities on the inside. Here's the technical reality. Standard ARC has lower bandwidth requirements, and most basic HDMI cables can handle it without any issue, even older or budget cables that have been sitting in a drawer for years. But eARC, with its much higher bandwidth needs for carrying formats like Dolby True HD, Full Dolby Atmos, and DTS:X, requires a cable that's actually built and certified to handle that increased data load. If your TV and soundbar both support eARC, but you're using an old, low-quality, or uncertified cable, you can run into a range of problems. Sometimes the connection works, but randomly drops out for a split second here and there. Sometimes the system silently falls back to basic PCM stereo, even though Bitstream is selected correctly in the settings, because the cable simply can't sustain the bandwidth that true Atmos requires. Sometimes there's an audible delay between picture and sound, because the system is struggling to maintain a stable handshake between devices. In every one of these scenarios, the setup looks completely correct on paper. Right port, right settings, everything should be working. But the cable itself is the silent bottleneck holding the whole chain back. The fix is to use a properly certified high-speed or ultra-high-speed HDMI cable for any ARC connection, especially if you're trying to get full Atmos or other high bitrate audio formats through. Certified cables go through official testing to confirm they can actually sustain the bandwidth they claim to support. And that certification is usually indicated with a specific logo and sometimes a scannable QR code on the packaging. If you're already using a cable and suspect it might be the problem, particularly if your ARC connection has been acting unstable with dropouts or unexpected fallback to weaker audio, swapping in a new, properly rated cable is one of the cheapest and easiest things to try before spending more money assuming the soundbar itself is defective. It's also worth mentioning that if your TV doesn't support eARC at all, only standard ARC, you have another option entirely. Skip the TV as the middleman and connect your source device, like a Blu-ray player or streaming box, directly to your soundbar or AVAR's HDMI input instead. That way, the soundbar receives the original signal directly from the source rather than relying on the TV to relay it through ARC at all. Why ARC has such a bad reputation? It's worth pausing here to talk about why ARC gets such a frustrating reputation among regular consumers, because understanding this helps explain why these three mistakes are so widespread in the first place. Part of the problem is naming inconsistency across the industry. The underlying technology behind ARC, eARC, and SEC is fundamentally the same regardless of brand, but every manufacturer insists on using its own marketing terminology for these features. What Samsung calls one thing, LG calls something else, and Sony calls something else again. A setting that should function identically across every brand ends up feeling completely different depending on which TV or soundbar you happen to own. And that inconsistency makes the whole topic feel more confusing and unreliable than it actually is at a technical level. The other major contributor is that visual confirmation, like the Dolby Atmos logo appearing on screen, creates a false sense of certainty. People reasonably assume that if the logo is showing, the full experience must be happening correctly. But as we covered, that logo only confirms the source content contains Atmos data. It says nothing about whether your TV's output settings, your cable, or your port selection are actually allowing that data to reach your soundbar intact. This gap between what the screen tells you and what's actually happening in the audio chain is exactly why so many people conclude their soundbar must be defective or simply not as good as advertised, when the real issue was sitting in a settings menu or a port choice the entire time. Putting it all together, the three-step check. Now that you understand all three mistakes individually, here's how to think about fixing your own setup as a complete process rather than three separate unrelated problems. Start with the port. Confirm that your soundbar or AVR is physically connected to the TV's labeled ARC or eARC port, not just whichever port happened to be open and convenient when you set things up. If you're not sure which port that is, check your TV's manual or look up your specific model number, because the labeling alone might be too faded or awkwardly placed to spot easily. Once the port is confirmed correct, move to the settings. Go into your TV's audio output menu and make sure it's set to Bitstream, auto, or passthrough rather than PCM, so the original audio format travels through untouched instead of getting quietly downgraded before it ever reaches your sound system. While you're there, enable Sec-A under whatever name your TV brand uses for it. And confirm your soundbar's input is set to receive from TV ARC or eARC specifically. Finally, consider the cable. If you're chasing full Atmos or any high bitrate audio format, and you're experiencing dropouts, unexpected fallback to basic stereo, or sync delays, don't assume your hardware is broken before ruling out the cable. Swap in a certified high-speed or ultra-high-speed HDMI cable and see if the problem resolves, because an unsuitable cable can sabotage an otherwise perfectly configured setup. Go through these three checks in order: port, settings, cable, and in the overwhelming majority of cases you'll land on exactly what was holding your audio back. None of these fixes require buying new equipment or spending any real money. They require about 5 minutes of attention to details that are easy to overlook, but make a dramatic difference once corrected. Here's the bottom line. HDMI ARC and eARC are genuinely excellent technologies when they're set up correctly, and the vast majority of complaints about weak sound, missing Atmos, or random dropouts have nothing to do with the soundbar or AVR being defective. They come down to one of three things: the wrong HDMI port being used, the TV's audio output quietly downgrading the signal before it reaches your sound system, or a cable that isn't actually capable of carrying the bandwidth your format requires. Before you blame your expensive soundbar or consider returning it, take 5 minutes to check these three things in your own setup. There's a very good chance you'll find the actual culprit sitting in a settings menu rather than in the hardware you already paid for. If this video helped you finally understand what was going wrong with your setup, hit that like button and share it with anyone you know who's been frustrated by their soundbar or AV not performing the way it should. Drop a comment below telling me which of these three mistakes turned out to be the problem in your own system. I'm genuinely curious how common each one actually is among everyone watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because there's a lot more practical home theater content like this coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.